Would you please turn your Bibles once again to John chapter 19? John chapter 19. Last week, we watched in horror as Pontius Pilate made a brutal presentation. To the enormous crowd gathered outside the governor's headquarters, Pilate showed them Jesus. At John chapter 19, verse 4, Pilate came out to the balcony that overlooks the courtyard below, and he said to the religious leaders and to the crowds, "Behold, I am bringing him out to you, that you may know that I find no fault in him." But what was so horrific about that presentation is that before Pilate brought Jesus out to show him to the crowd, Jesus was first subjected to a period of mockery and torture. Pilate handed Jesus over to his soldiers to have him scourged. He was whipped with a device upon which the strips of leather were embedded with sharp pieces of metal. And this device is designed to cut and remove the flesh. And after this scourging, the soldiers then subjected Jesus to more physical abuse as they mocked him. Because the Sanhedrin, the Jewish rulers of Israel, accused Jesus of being a king, the soldiers decided they would dress Jesus for the part. First, they put on him a crown of thorns. Then they dressed him in a purple robe, a color that would suggest royalty. After Pilate's soldiers dressed him in this way, as a mocking caricature of a king, Pilate then told the crowds he was about to show Jesus to them. Pilate announced again at 19:4, "Behold, I am going to bring him out to you, that you may know that I find no fault in him." We agreed that it was odd that Pilate would present Jesus in this state, beaten and bloody, in an attempt to convince the crowds to share his view, when he said, "that you may know that I find no fault in him." That is a strange and horrible way to treat someone, to scourge them after you've determined that they're innocent. But I suggested a possible reason Pilate did this. I suggested that this was Pilate's twisted attempt to gain pity for Jesus, in hopes the people would change their minds and call for the release of Jesus rather than Barabbas, who they insisted on earlier. And this was Pilate's third attempt to release Jesus, and yet attempt to avoid personal responsibility for releasing Jesus. In the previous attempt, Pilate reminded the people of an important Passover tradition. He said to the people, "You have a custom that I should release someone to you at the Passover." He then offered them Jesus. But as we heard, the chief priests stirred up the crowd and caused them to call instead for Barabbas, who we know was an actual rebel and a murderer. The reason Pilate didn't want to take personal responsibility for releasing Jesus, but wanted the crowds to call for his release, is because Pilate was afraid of the reaction of the Sanhedrin. He knew that if he released Jesus, they would be infuriated. And Pilate needed their cooperation if he was successfully to rule as governor of this very volatile region of the empire. But what was even more serious was the very real threat that the Jews would send a message to Rome to report him. If he released this man, Jesus, They might send a communique to Caesar saying, "We handed one of our own countrymen over to your authorities because he was planning a rebellion and to make himself king of Israel, but your governor released him." After Pilate's failed attempt to release Jesus using the Passover custom of releasing a prisoner, he tried this twisted strategy of presenting Jesus dressed as a pathetic caricature of a king, wearing a crown of thorns and a purple robe, beaten and bloody. And Pilate called out to the crowd, saying in Latin, "Ecce homo," meaning, "Behold the man." He hoped that the crowd, seeing this bloody and pathetic man, would change its mind, and rather than insist on releasing Barabbas, would shout out, "Give us Jesus." But once again, Pilate underestimated the manipulative power of the chief priests. In the last verse that we considered last week, at John 19, verse 6, the chief priests began a chant saying, "Crucify, crucify." And this is precisely the kind of one-word slogan that is easily picked up by the crowd. The kind of sloganeering that would change an angry crowd into a violent mob. And it is safe to say that soon this courtyard began to roar as hundreds, if not thousands of people were shouting, "Crucify, crucify." And so, let's pick up where we left off, please, and continue in the remainder of verse 6. Pilate said to them, that is the religious leaders that are closest to the balcony from which Pilate is speaking. Pilate said to them, "You take him and crucify him, for I find no fault in him." For the third time, Pilate announces his findings. "I find no fault in him." After Pilate subjected Jesus to a series of questions, the governor has decided that this man is no threat to Rome. While this man is no threat to Rome and poses no challenge to Caesar, Pilate can see that this man is a threat to the religious leaders. But as he declares his findings yet again, saying, "I find no fault in him," it is clear that Pilate is annoyed and he is angry. Because as he repeats his verdict, he also makes a statement that reveals his frustration. He shouts out, "You take him and crucify him." Now, the religious leaders, let alone the crowd, they have no authority to carry out the death penalty. As we discussed several weeks ago, capital punishment was a sentence that was jealously guarded by the Romans and could only be ordered by the governor. Why? This was to protect Jewish collaborators, Jews who were working with the Romans, such as tax collectors, from being falsely accused of a crime and then being executed by the Jews. There were occasions when angry mobs might shirk the Roman law and subject someone to stoning, but that was the exception rather than the rule. Only the Romans could carry out an execution, and this by crucifixion. Hypothetically, Pilate could have said to the crowd, "You take him and do with him what you will." In effect, if you are so set on having this man dead, take him out and stone him according to your law. But Pilate doesn't say that. And so when he says, "You take him and crucify him," we know that Pilate does not actually mean what he's saying. The Sanhedrin can't crucify Jesus, and Pilate would never permit it. What Pilate is effectively saying in this facetious statement is, I give up. This is the kind of statement a parent might make to a child after being endlessly pestered for one more cookie. And the parent who's at the end of his or her rope might say, eat the whole box to see if I care. Now, the parent doesn't mean what they say. They're venting. They're speaking in frustration. Pilate wants nothing to do with crucifying an innocent man, about whom he just said, I find no fault in him. And so he says in frustration, he says facetiously, you take him and crucify him, even though he doesn't mean what he says. Let's also notice that as he makes this facetious statement, we find Pilate making a stark contrast that is signaled by his use of emphatic pronouns. First, Pilate says, you take him and crucify him. But then he quickly adds, I find no fault in him. Do you see the contrast? You take him and crucify him. I find no fault in him. He's drawing a huge contrast between what the crowd wants and what he wants. Pilate does not want to be responsible for crucifying an innocent man. It is here that Matthew adds that Pilate calls for a basin of water to be brought to him. And in a symbolic act, Pilate washes his hands in front of the crowd and says, I am innocent of this man's blood. But the governor is deceiving himself. As Jesus will make clear later in this passage, Pilate is far from innocent of this man's blood. The religious leaders recognize that Pilate's call for them to crucify Jesus, that's not a legitimate offer. It's not a genuine offer. They know that. Therefore, they continue to press Pilate to use his power to execute the prisoner, Jesus, that is now in their custody. Let's go, please, to verse 7. John 19, verse 7. The Jews answered him, we have a law, and according to our law he ought to die, because he made himself the Son of God. Pilate just used emphatic pronouns to accentuate the difference between his position and the position of the crowd. The religious leaders now use some emphatic pronouns of their own. Notice, we have a law, and according to our law, he ought to die. The Sanhedrin finally tips its hand and reveals the true reason they brought Jesus to Pilate. Before, they presented him as a threat to Caesar because they said he claims to be a king. That is, a king the kind of king that Pilate envisions, a king who would wield the sword and lead troops into battle. But now, the religious leaders can see that their plan is not working. They know their plan is not working because Pilate has now announced 3 times that this man is innocent, that he's no threat to Jesus. He says, I find no fault in him. And so now, the religious leaders make a new argument. Even if Pilate has decided that Jesus should not be executed for breaking the Roman law, they are now arguing that he needs to die because he's broken their law, their religious law. And they give Pilate a quick explanation about how he has broken their law. They say he ought to die because he made himself the Son of God, meaning this man claims to be the Son of God. The law they are claiming has been broken was likely unknown to Caesar, but it is known to us because we have available to us the Old Testament. They are referring to Leviticus 24:16. I'll read it to you, and it says this: whoever blasphemes the name of the Lord shall surely be put to death. The religious leaders labeled Jesus as a blasphemer almost as soon as he began his ministry. On a previous visit to Jerusalem, Jesus went to a pool called Bethesda. We saw this back in chapter 5, probably several years ago now. But in chapter 5, Jesus made a previous visit to Jerusalem, and he went to a pool called Bethesda because there were people waiting for the pool to be stirred so that the first one in it could be healed. And Jesus met a man there who had never walked. And Jesus said to that man, "Pick up your mat and walk." And he did. When the religious leaders of Jerusalem learned of this healing, they didn't celebrate that miracle. They were angry. They were angry because Jesus healed on the Sabbath. And so in John chapter 5, the Apostle John gave this report. Listen, therefore, the Jews sought all the more to kill him because he not only broke the Sabbath, but also said that God was his Father, making himself equal with God. It is on this basis they now make their new accusation before Pilate. As they say, he ought to die because he claims to be the Son of God. Well, this sparks an unexpected response from Pilate. We might have expected Pilate to scoff at their accusation. The Son of God, that's absurd, we might have expected Pilate to say. But Pilate does not scoff. Instead, he reacts with fear. Let's look, please, at verse 8. Therefore, when Pilate heard that saying, he was the more afraid, and he went again into the praetorium, and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave no answer. Verse 10, then Pilate said to him, "Are you not speaking to me? Do you not know that I have power to crucify you and the power to release you?" When Pilate heard from the religious leaders that this man was claiming to be the Son of God, it made Pilate the more afraid. Or as the NIV has it, it made him even more afraid. Now that tells us that Pilate was afraid before. If he's even more afraid now, it means he was afraid before. Afraid of what, we might ask? Well, there are a number of possibilities. But I think the most pressing fear is what this agitated crowd might do. Matthew 27 tells us that it is at this point that Pilate realized that a riot might occur. But right now, his fear is not about a rioting crowd. Pilate's fear is about who this Jesus might be. Could this be the Son of God? Pilate is thinking. From Pilate's perspective, this would mean, could this be the Son of the Hebrew God? Just to be clear, the fear that Pilate is feeling is a fear of possible vengeance against him. Pilate has just had Jesus scourged. He's a bleeding mess. And if this is the Son of the Hebrew God, Pilate may be worried, fearful, that he has just invited upon himself the vengeance of a God. Let's also bear in mind that Pilate, as a Roman, comes from a pagan, polytheistic world, meaning Pilate believes there are many gods. Merrill Tenney explains that in the Greco Roman culture, in Greco-Roman mythology, the gods that lived on Mount Olympus frequently consorted, meaning had physical relations, with men and women, and their semi-divine offspring, such as Hercules, appeared on earth and performed great and miraculous deeds. And so the people of this time, the Romans, the Greeks, they believed that the gods could have relations with human women and create semi-divine beings, people like Hercules, who had great power. The point is, it was common among first century pagan cultures to believe that the gods came in the likeness of men and walked among us. Consider this. In the book of Acts, there is an interesting episode that sheds light on Pilate's religious mindset. In the book of Acts, Paul and his associate Barnabas are on a missionary journey in the Greek city of Lystra. As they are proclaiming the gospel of Jesus Christ, Paul heals a man who had never walked. After this miraculous healing, Acts 14, verse 11 says this. I'll read it to you. Now, when the people saw what Paul had done, this miraculous healing, they raised their voices, saying in the Lycaonian language, "The gods have come down to us in the likeness of men." And Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul they called Hermes. And so, like the citizens of Lystra, Pilate, as a polytheist, could entertain the possibility of a Hebrew God and that this God could have a son. So you might be asking yourself, do you mean to say that the Gentile people were more likely to understand God coming in the form of a man than the Jews? The answer is yes. The ways of God are not man's ways. This possibility of God coming in the form of a man, the Son of God, made Pilate even more afraid than before. And so Pilate turns from the chief priests. He leaves the balcony and he goes once again inside to the praetorium. And I imagine that Pilate signaled to one of the soldiers, "Take Jesus." And they grabbed him, that soldier grabbed Jesus by the arm and walked Jesus back into the praetorium to follow Pilate, because Pilate wants to question Jesus about this new development apart from the ears of the chief priests. The governor brings Jesus back into the praetorium, into the governor's residence, and he says to Jesus, "Where are you from?" He is not asking Jesus about his birthplace or about where he was raised. In fact, earlier this morning, Pilate learned that Jesus was from Galilee. How do we know that? Because we saw from one of the other Gospels that when Pilate learned that Jesus was from Galilee, he sent him to Herod Antipas, who's the governor of Galilee, because Pilate was trying to get rid of him. So, when Pilate asks, "Where are you from?" he's not asking, "What's your hometown?" He wants to know where he's really from. For us, for the reader, we know the answer to this question. We know it well. We have been told throughout this gospel that Jesus was sent by the Father and that Jesus has come down from heaven. When the fearful Pilate asks, "Where are you from?" it is because he wants to know if there is any truth to what the religious leaders just said about him being the Son of God. But as we are told at the end of verse 8, Jesus gave him no answer. "Are you the Son of God?" Jesus is silent. This is a bit surprising, because during this trial, of Jesus before Pilate, Jesus has answered Pilate's questions until now. Why is he silent with this question? We are not told, but I have a possible suggestion. In this case, silence is a form of judgment. Let's recall that earlier in this exchange, Jesus was asked by Pilate, "Are you a king?" Jesus explained that he is a king, but not the kind of king that Pilate envisions. He's not a king that wields the sword. Jesus explained his kingship. And Jesus said this at verse 37, "For this cause I was born, and for this cause," notice, "I came into the world." Why? "That I should bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice." And let's remember how Pilate responded to Jesus, saying that he had come to bear witness to the truth. Pilate sarcastically asked, "What is truth?" Pilate obviously was not of the truth, and so he could not hear Christ's voice. And so even if Jesus gave Pilate an answer to that question, "Where are you from?" a question we know the answer to, Pilate would be unable to receive it or to understand it. And so Jesus remained silent. But this did not sit well with Pilate. Oh. If we look at verse 10, Pilate says, "Are you not speaking to me?" Our English translations do not follow the word order of the Greek. The Greek text has this word order: "To me, you are not speaking." Do you see how it emphasizes Pilate? To me, you are not speaking? He's the governor of Judea. A man of his power, of his position, is not accustomed to having his questions ignored. Therefore, Pilate explains to his prisoner why it is not wise to meet his questions with silence. He says to Jesus, "Do you not know that I have the power to crucify you and the power to release you?" Jesus now breaks his silence, and he does so for the purpose of correcting the governor. Let's move to verse 11, please. Jesus answered, "You could have no power at all against me unless it had been given to you from above. Therefore, the one who delivered me to you has the greater sin." These are the final words that Jesus will speak to Pilate. And here Jesus states explicitly who's in charge. As readers, we've known all along who is in charge. While the Sanhedrin and Pilate were under the impression they were in charge, we've known all along who's really in charge. Jesus has been in control the whole time. And he is working out all things according to the purpose of his will. But now Jesus makes it explicitly clear that he is in charge. It may seem to Pilate that he has the power of life and death, but Pilate would not have that authority of life and death unless Jesus says it had been given to you from above. And clearly, when Jesus speaks of power given from above, he means heaven. And since we know that Jesus has come from above, and since we know that he is God come in the flesh, we also know that whatever authority Pilate may have, that authority was given to him by Christ himself. And so when Pilate says, "I have the authority," no, it's the man in front of him who has the authority. At this moment, as Jesus stands before Pilate, beaten and bloody, It certainly didn't seem to Pilate that Jesus was in control. And at this point, if we didn't know what was coming, it would not seem to us that Jesus was in control, not in the current state that he's in. But when Jesus rises from the grave, then it will be clear who has all authority in heaven, and on earth. And when Jesus rises from the grave, we can say, as did Thomas when he saw the resurrected Christ, "My Lord and my God." Since God is sovereign, and Pilate can only do what God allows, Jesus will now speak about the issue of sin. Pilate has been given power by God, but Pilate and all people who are in authority are accountable with how that power is used. Although God has given Pilate the power to crucify, that does not excuse Pilate from the sin he is about to commit. At the end of verse 11, Jesus says to Pilate, "Therefore, the one who delivered me to you has the greater sin." As a point of clarification, as Jesus speaks about the one who delivered you to me, this does not point to Judas. It points to Caiaphas. Now, Judas is right now bearing eternal punishment for his sin. But this verse doesn't refer to Judas. The reason being, Judas did not deliver Jesus to Pilate. Judas delivered Jesus to Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin. Therefore, it was Caiaphas who Jesus says bears the greatest sin. It was Caiaphas who was the one, he's talking about one person. Caiaphas was the one who delivered Jesus into the hands of Pilate. He, Caiaphas, bears the greater sin. And we will surmise that he bears the greater sin because Caiaphas, as the high priest, had access to all of the Old Testament prophecies, all of which pointed that Jesus is the Christ. But by saying that Caiaphas has the greater sin, it implies that Pilate also has sin. Am I right? If he has greater sin, it means Pilate has sin. And so Pilate will also be held accountable for his role in executing the Son of God. After that exchange, Pilate is now weighing the possibility that he's dealing with a God-man who may have access to divine powers. And if he is the Son of the Hebrew God, Pilate has to be considering if Pilate will be the victim of this God's revenge. Let's go, please, to verse 12. From then on, Pilate sought to release him. But the Jews cried out, saying, "If you let this man go, you are not Caesar's friend. Whoever makes himself a king speaks against Caesar." When the beginning of this verse says, "From then on, Pilate sought to release him," that doesn't mean that only now the governor is seeking to release Jesus. We've already seen 3 attempts of Pilate seeking to release Jesus. Let me also bring to your attention that the verb tense in the Greek text indicates that this is the latest in an ongoing series of attempts to release Jesus. And so the best way to understand the beginning of this sentence is, from then on, Pilate sought all the more to release him. We're not told how Pilate attempted this strengthened, this renewed effort to release Jesus. But it appears that it was the result of a verbal exchange between the chief priests and Pilate. It may be the case that Pilate tried all the more to reason with these religious leaders, but they were having nothing of it. And we are deducing that this was a verbal exchange based on the fact that the chief priests now cry out in response. From the courtyard, the chief priests cry out to Pilate, verse 12, "If you let this man go, you are not Caesar's friend. Whoever makes himself a king speaks against Caesar." Let's notice that in the first sentence they are speaking about Pilate. They say, if you, Pilate, if you let this man go, you are not Caesar's friend. And then in the second sentence, they're speaking about Jesus. They say, whoever makes himself a king speaks against Caesar. Let's start with this second statement where they're referring to Jesus, and then we'll go back to the first statement. The religious leaders have concluded that their most recent attempt to convince Pilate that this man deserves to die based on their blasphemy laws has not gained any traction. They're saying he deserves to die because he made himself the Son of God, but they're realizing that's not working. How do we know it's not working? Because Pilate came back and sought all the more to release him. Therefore, the religious leaders go back to their earlier charge in which they accuse Jesus of being a king. And so they shout to the governor, whoever makes himself a king speaks against Caesar. In short, here's what they're doing. They are accusing Jesus of being an enemy of Caesar. It's that simple. This man, Jesus, is an enemy of Caesar. With that in mind, let's look again at the first statement where they're talking to Pilate about Pilate. They say to Pilate, if you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar's. This is a masterstroke of diabolical manipulation. A masterstroke of diabolical manipulation. This is the definition of extortion. They are using a threat to get what they want. They are very careful in their language, using great skill not to step over a certain line. Here's what they say. If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar's. But allow me to give you the subtext, meaning the unspoken meaning that's below the surface of this carefully worded threat. They have just accused Jesus of planning a rebellion against Caesar and Jesus making himself the king of Israel. Therefore, based on that accusation, Jesus is an enemy of Caesar. And when they turn to Pilate and say, if you let this man go, they're saying you are an enemy of Caesar. Jesus is an enemy of Caesar, and if you let him go, you are an enemy of Caesar. That's what they mean. From a human perspective, this threat from the Sanhedrin has sealed Jesus' fate. It's over. In Pilate's mind, it's now impossible to release Jesus. Let's go, please, to verse 13. When Pilate therefore heard that saying of them accusing him of being an enemy of Caesar, he brought Jesus out and sat down in the judgment seat in a place that is called the Pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now it was the preparation day of the Passover, and about the 6th hour. And he said to the Jews, behold your king. But they cried out, away with him, crucify him. After the extortion threat made by the chief priests, Pilate's got the message. He could not ignore their insinuation that if he released Jesus, he was siding with an accused rebel over Caesar. To release Jesus would be an act of treason. If the Sanhedrin sent word to Rome and make this accusation that Pilate was siding with an insurrectionist, not only would this mean the end of Pilate's career, but very likely the end of his life. The current Caesar, Tiberius Caesar, was known to execute any official who did not serve him loyally. Pilate makes no verbal response to the religious leaders. Instead, Pilate brings Jesus out once again to appear before the religious leaders and the crowds. Pilate takes his place on the judgment seat, in Greek, the bema. As Leon Morris says, this looks like a solemn preparation for the end of this case. Ordinarily, listen, this is important. Ordinarily, the governor taking his place on the judgment seat would signal he's about to do two things. He's going to hand down, ordinarily this would mean, he's going to hand down his official verdict regarding this case, and more importantly, what the sentence will be that he will impose. I say ordinarily because in the end, Pilate will never officially declare a verdict, nor will he officially declare from the judgment seat how this man is to be punished. Instead, what we will see in effect is that Jesus is swept up by the momentum of this angry mob. As Pilate takes his place on the judgment seat, the Apostle John gives us two details about the place and the time. John tells us that the judgment seat was located in a place called the Pavement. And in Hebrew, while some of your Bibles may have Aramaic, it is called Gabbatha. The Greek word translated for us as pavement can refer to stone pavers, large blocks used by the Roman for pavers. And so the word pavement can refer to stone pavers, or it can refer to an area that is set in mosaic tile. The word John uses is usually a generic term, but in this case, notice that this place is referred to as the pavement. Given the fact that this refers to the place where the governor sits on his judgment seat and makes the decision between life and death, we will conclude that the pavement carries an ominous connotation for the Jewish residents of the city. We're also given a Hebrew or Aramaic rendering of this place. The Jews called it Gabbatha. The meaning of this word is uncertain, but it most likely refers to a high place or a balcony. And so putting these words together, we are able to draw this visual image of Pilate on a porch or terrace where he is overlooking a courtyard where the crowds are gathered. Up until now, it is from this place, the pavement, that Pilate has been speaking to the crowds below. But now it is in this same place that Pilate takes his place on the bema, that is the judgment seat. John also tells us in verse 14 that it was the preparation day of the Passover. And he gives us an approximation of the time. He says it was about the 6th hour. These references, especially to the preparation day, as it relates to the timing of the Passover, has posed a challenge to scholars. The challenge concerns how John's account compares to the 3 synoptic Gospels regarding the timing of the Passover. Our time this morning, however, does not permit us to consider how the 4 Gospels harmonize. But what is most important is that most scholars agree that Jesus was crucified on a Friday. And in regard to the hour, John says it is now about the 6th hour, meaning it is coming on 12 noon. As stated earlier, as Pilate takes his place on the judgment seat, ordinarily, we would expect the governor to give his official verdict and what sentence he will impose. But he does not do that. You see, if he did, he would have to make an absurd statement. He would have to declare, I find no fault in him, that's my verdict, but then he would have to go on and say, therefore, I order him to death by crucifixion, based on what we know is going to happen. But that combination of two things would be absurd, and Pilate knows it. And so he does not say that. Instead, what he does say, as Jesus stands on the pavement, on that balcony overlooking the courtyard, while Pilate is on the judgment seat, here is what Pilate says: "Behold, your king." I suggest, as Pilate says those words to the religious leaders and to the crowd, his words are full of scorn and hatred. He despises the Sanhedrin and the chief priests for manipulating the crowds. He hates them for the manipulative scheming they've committed against him to push him into this position. And he hates the people who are so easily convinced to call for, even demand the death of an innocent man. And so Pilate shouts to the crowds below, "Behold, your king." Now he's mocking the crowd. They claimed he was a king. And so Pilate, I would suggest his voice dripping with sarcasm, declares, "You wanted a king? Here then is your king." Please do not think that Pilate is innocent. Jesus himself said he bears sin for what is happening here. But as Pilate says, "Here is your king," this presentation did not sit well with the crowds. They knew that he was being sarcastic when he presented their king. And so they will make certain that Pilate knows they've disowned this man. And they want to make it clear, this is no king of theirs. Let's go finally to verse 15 and 16. But they cried out, "Away with him! Away with him! Crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." Then he delivered him to them to be crucified. Then they took Jesus and led him away. After Pilate presented Jesus as your king, it seems the crowd grew even more enraged. They shout, "Away with him! Away with him!" To my ears, that sounds like they're saying, "We've heard enough. Get him out of our sight. Away with him." And they're very clear in telling Pilate how he ought to bring him away, how he should get rid of Jesus for them. They shout, "Crucify him." But Pilate will make one last attempt to give the people an opportunity to turn from their wicked ways. In the last words we will hear from Pilate, he then said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The answer to this question comes from the chief priests, and it is a revealing, and it is a despicable answer. The chief priests shout to Pilate, "We have no king but Caesar." That is a ludicrous answer coming from these so-called priests. According to the Old Testament's teaching, there is no king but God himself. But here they are claiming as their king a foreign, pagan man, Caesar, who demands that the whole world should worship him as a god. Oh. Now, they may be saying this to further twist and manipulate Pilate, They may be claiming Caesar as their king only for the purpose of forcing Pilate's hand, but their words express a truth that they are too blind to see, and their hearts are too hard to admit. By rejecting Christ, the truth is they have no king but Caesar. By rejecting Christ, they have no king but Caesar. By their murderous rejection of Jesus, they show that their true allegiance is to the kingdom of this world. And anyone who puts their allegiance and their loyalty to the kingdom of this world, and therefore rejects Jesus and refuses to have Christ as king, that person has no hope and no claim on the kingdom of God. Pilate thinks there is nothing more he can do. He recognizes he is defeated. He probably told himself, I have no choice. But there's always a choice. He had a choice to do the right thing and release Jesus. But instead, he would sacrifice this man's life in order to save his career. His power and his position were more important to him than the life of an innocent man. And so as this tragic scene draws to a close, verse 16 says, he delivered him to them to be crucified. Grammatically, as Pilate delivers Jesus to them, this would point to the chief priests. But we know the chief priests will not be the ones who crucify Jesus. This duty will be done by Pilate's soldiers. But John uses this ambiguous word, them. And he likely uses it intentionally. What John likely means by saying that Pilate handed Jesus over to them, meaning to the chief priests and to the crowd, is that Pilate handed Jesus over to their murderous desires. And that seems to be confirmed by Luke's gospel, where it is said in Luke 23 that Pilate, quote, delivered Jesus to their will. Delivered Jesus to their will. Their murderous, God-hating, Christ-denying will. But next week, when we see Jesus delivered to that infamous hill called Golgotha, that is the place of the skull, we will bear in mind that all of this is happening according to the purpose of God's will. And what is God's will? That we should believe upon the Lord Jesus Christ. For whosoever believes in him shall not perish, but have everlasting life. Let's pray. You, Lord Jesus, are King. Yours, O Lord, is the greatness and the power and the glory and the victory and majesty. Lord, the throne is yours forever, and we will glorify you now and for all eternity. Amen.